Welcome to the next presentation in God's Temple of Truth. This one is entitled 1840 what? Brothers and sisters, as you would have seen in the previous presentation, the date of 1844 is highlighted through the sanctuary process. And we're going to be looking at this date and having a look why it is that 1844 is either important or unimportant to Christianity. Let's start off again with the statement on truth. Truth is independent of your or my opinion. Truth is also intolerant of error. Every aspect of a truthful message stimulates the conscience and requests acknowledgement. The individual, however, holds the key to accept or reject that message. As you've seen in this presentation, one presentation is built on the previous one. And you can see how this truth is unfolding. The problem is that it's all nice and fun until it touches you personally. And it's how it's going to touch us as Christians that's going to become important. So I'm bringing in this quote about truth now so that you can remember that what you've seen up to this point has been truth, because it's going to come closer and closer to home in the next couple of presentations. Let's look again at the 2,300-day prophecy and the 70-week prophecy. You will by now recognize the timeline and the movement, right? And God's people, God's apostles, God's church left behind as He ascends into heaven. And then there's that 3.5-year period until 34 AD when the gospel goes to the Gentiles. Brothers and sisters, please make sure that you understand this 3.5 years that I'm depicting here is not from the cross to His ascension. That was 2 days basically from the death on Friday night to Sunday morning. So that was in days, but His ascension to heaven all the way up to 34 AD is depicted there by the 3.5 years. So that is 3.5 years from the cross, there from 31 AD, all the way past His ascension to 34 AD when the gospel goes to the Gentiles. Now, watch as the graphic moves, and this is just to bring back what we've discussed. Hopefully it'll make sense again. 457 BC was behind the veil. This was 457 BC. The decree went out to rebuild Jerusalem. 483 years up to 27 AD, this was unto the Messiah, His baptism. Then a 3.5-year period up to 31 AD when the Messiah was cut off, but not for Himself, in other words, for us. Then a 3.5-year period, His ascension, and that period then up to 34 AD when the gospel goes to the Gentiles. But then that period of 1810 years to this date of 1844 when the sanctuary is cleansed. That was the movement that we've discussed and the coming of the Son of Man to save that which was lost. Something I wanted to mention, I'm not sure if I did mention it to you the other day or not, and that is that Matthew 18 verse 11. The Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. We are in the outer court, right, as pagans or as lost people. The Son of Man has come from the Most Holy to save that which was lost. If you want to read that text, and I believe it's one of the most important texts in the Bible, you will have to have either a King James or a New King James, because in the new Bibles that's been removed. And there have been reasons for that, which I'll explain in the next couple of presentations. But let's go back to the graphic. This period, including the 1810 years, from 457 before Christ to 1844, this 2,300-year prophecy is the longest prophecy in the Bible, and the only one which shows Jesus' complete journey through the sanctuary. Right? From His position as God, with God in the Most Holy, out into the outer court to be crucified, back to Him receiving His commissioned as our high priest. And then as the high priest, once in the cycle, moving into the most holy, his entire journey through the sanctuary, brothers and sisters. This highlights that critical date of 1844, when Jesus moved from the holy place to the most holy place. And my question I asked you is, why is this date critical to Christianity? To understand that, we need to go back to the sanctuary service. I want to discuss now with you the Jewish feasts in type and in antitype. This arrow down the left here is one Jewish year, and the one Jewish year equals the entire Christian era. What do I mean by that? Well, every year there were certain ceremonies that the Jews went through. They went through the various feasts and the festivals. Every year it was repeated. That was the type. The antitype, the antitype, the antitypical fulfillment is not happens once every year, but once in a cycle between the coming of Christ's first time that he was on earth and his second time that he comes to fetch his people. So in the small version, the 1 year of Jewish tradition refers and points to the full duration or era of Christianity, from the time that Christ was on earth to the time that he comes to fetch his children. So we must look at the feasts and festivals inside the Jewish year and see how they were fulfilled somewhere between Christ's coming and Christ's second coming. So let's have a look. What I say here is one Jewish year equals the entire Christian era. Have a look at this. Here we have the type, and here we have the antitype. Now, there were various feasts and festivals. Like the first one was known as the Passover festival feast, right? That was known as Nisan 14. That's the 14th of March or the 14th of April. Nisan is a month. It's not a car that you drive, right? It's a month. Nisan 14, the 14th day was the Passover, right? Now that's the type. There it is, the Passover type. The Passover lamb points to something. What does the Passover lamb point to? Let me rephrase it. Who does the Passover lamb refer to or point to? Jesus Christ. So there, the Passover lamb points to the crucifixion. As you can see, the Passover in history points to the crucifixion, and we've seen in our presentations how Jesus is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and he opened not his mouth. And the type, the small type in the Old Testament, becomes the big fulfillment antitype in the New Testament. Jesus becomes the lamb with a capital L. So there you have the first Jewish feast fulfilled in the crucifixion. Now there were 7, and we're going to work through those. The second one was the very next day. There's Nisan 14. Here's Nisan 15. This was known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And where was Jesus the day after his crucifixion? He was in the grave. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread points to Jesus Christ in the grave. Unleavened. Remember, in the Bible, leaven is a symbol of sin. So unleavened bread, Jesus said, I am the bread of life. This is the sinless bread. This is the representation of Jesus. What else can we see? We go to the third feast. It was the Feast of First Fruits, that was on the day of Nisan 16. So 14 there, 15, 16. Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus in the grave, and then the very next day, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as we know, on the first day of the week. Now, these are boom, 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 14, 15, 16, or as we have the fulfillment today, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, of the crucifixion scene of Jesus Christ. The next feast that you found was the Feast of Weeks, Sivan 6. That was a couple of weeks later. We'll get to that in a later presentation. And this points to Pentecost, the harvest of souls. Then you had another feast called the Feast of Trumpets. That points to the Second Advent movement, which we'll be discussing in the next presentation. And then you have the Day of Atonement. This was Tishri 10. That points to pre-Advent judgment in 1844. Then you have the last Feast of Tishri 15, that's pointing towards the home-going event. This is called the Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus has gone to prepare a place for his people. And the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will be their God and they will be his people. The Feast of Tabernacles points to the coming of Christ. So look at the graphic. From the crucifixion right through to the second coming of Christ, right? These are the anti-typical fulfillments of those feast days. Now, if we are a Christian, and if we believe that Jesus is the Lamb, that means that we believe in the sanctuary. That means that we must look at the feasts and festivals and see how those pertain to our Christian experience. So my question is, what happened to sin in the Old Testament? Say, for example, if you confessed your sins, where did the sins go? And I bring this up specifically because today as Christians, we are all about forgiveness and all about confessing our sins. But there's no real understanding of what happens to the sin. So I'm going to get into that just now, but let's first go to the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, if I as a sinner confessed my sin, where did the sin go? And here's an example. Say, for example, I stole the axe from my neighbor. So if I confessed my sins, the theft of an axe from my neighbor, where did the sins go? Do they just disappear? Do the sins just vanish? If I confess my sins, what happens to them? Let's go back to the sanctuary and have a look at this. Please note that the sanctuary was set up in the middle of Israel and visible to all. Have a look at the whole of Israel camped around here, the 12 tribes of Israel, right? And here, and there's the Mount Sinai, here all of Israel could see and recognize that the sanctuary was set up in the middle of Israel. The whole of Israel knew it was there. They recognized it because it was physically visible to them. Let's continue. The sinner's mind takes him into the most holy, and he recognizes the law, that he has broken the law, and is therefore subject to a death sentence. Looking into this graphic, there's somebody out there that's stolen that person's axe, right? This person, because he has the sanctuary in front of him, knows that in the most holy there is the law of God. There in the most holy, underneath the presence of the Shekinah glory, go back to the graphic, remember the pillar of cloud, right? Well, underneath that was the presence of God, underneath the presence of God was the law. The sinner knows that because he has sinned, he has stolen his neighbor's axe, he's broken the law. And if you break the law of God, you are subject to a death sentence. This is what the Old Testament was taught, and the people in the Old Testament. So he's literally got a death sentence hanging over his head. But let's have a look. Please remember that a death sentence is a very serious penalty. So it needs to be dealt with in a very serious and very structured way. You cannot, if I'm on death row in America or somewhere, if I'm on death row, I can't just hand my sin over and boom, it's gone. Death sentences have to be worked through in a very structured and very serious way. How did this happen? Well, literally the only way to be freed from that death sentence, which was obviously from the condemnation of the broken law, was for something else to die in the sinner's place. The only way for that sinner to be freed from that death sentence was to let something else die in his place. And what happened? The sinner therefore looks into the sanctuary for salvation. There's the sinner saying, I've broken the law, I'm under a death sentence. I'm going to have to come in here and look into the sanctuary for salvation. And here you can see the people walking in the bottom with their sacrifice. So the sinners recognized that the only way I can get rid of this death sentence is to go into the sanctuary and look for salvation, look for release, look for redemption. Now please, this death sentence that we have is very, very important. In the Old Testament and today. We're dealing with the Old Testament at the moment. Let's look at the process of transferring sin into the sanctuary.